Part two of the subject, Israel rejected God to have a king. And if you think about that, you think that's not really very good judgment anytime you reject God. So it wasn't a good decision on their part. I was thinking just a bit ago that it's kind of interesting that with the form of government we have in the United States, where we get a chance to re-elect a king every 4 years, I guess. We call him a president, but he's the highest official in the government. And sometimes people are happy with it, and sometimes people are not happy with it. But in this case, the nation Israel shouldn't have done it because it was a bad move. It was actually a rejection of God. And I want to say, you know, this is history. It's obviously the history of the nation Israel. It's something that maybe isn't, if from a standpoint of politics and government and the world we live in, it isn't going to affect us at all. And it isn't specific instruction to us and for us as to what we as members of the church, which is Christ's body, are supposed to be doing. But it's one of those things that we talked about when we first started this subject, that the scripture tells us was written for our learning, that was written as an example. The things that they did as example to us. And when Paul, writing to the church of Corinth, says that, he says so that we wouldn't do what they did as we look at life and deal with life, that the decision they made was not a good one. So don't do what they did. It's there for our learning. And it's interesting to me when we look at this, that there's a lot of information as to how the human mind works. When we follow the nation Israel, we could start back with the promise that was made by God to Abraham. We could start back there, but I won't start that far back. But if we go back to the nation Israel when they were in bondage in Egypt, they had went in as 70 souls. They began to multiply. The Pharaoh that existed at that time became fearful that they would maybe overpower them if they were particularly in a war situation. But God was using and directing, when it came time for them to come out of Egypt, used and directed a man by the name of Moses and another man by the name of Aaron, because Moses wasn't really too anxious to get involved in that job at all. And among other things, he said he couldn't speak well. And so God told him, okay, I'll speak to you. You speak to Aaron, and Aaron will speak to the people. But God was the one that picked Moses and picked Aaron and was inspiring them, we would say, to say what they said and to instruct Israel as they instructed Israel. And you couldn't have it any better than that as far as coming pretty direct from God. As they moved on, coming out of Egypt and beginning to wander in the wilderness, and finally into the land, and God pointed out 70 elders that was to help Moses in doing what he was doing in leading and guiding Israel. That's in Numbers chapter 11 and verse 16. And then, as we know, Moses, as their leader, sinned against God, and so he didn't get to go into the land that was promised to Israel, and that he had spent his life actually leading, his adult life, actually leading them in the direction of that land, and then round and round in the wilderness to the generation that refused to go into the land when they first got there, refused to go into the land, and God said, you'll wander in the wilderness till you all die. And then I will bring your children into the land, the people that you said you were afraid to go in and possess the land because they would die, because the people that inhabited the land were giants, and we were grasshoppers in their eyes, and we were grasshoppers in our eyes. And when Caleb and Joshua said, if the Lord be with us and he gives us the land, why, it's a piece of cake, in essence, using common vernacular. We can take that easy. and yet the people actually were worked up by the naysayers, the ones that said we can't take the land, that they wanted to kill Caleb and Joshua. So Moses dies, and then God uses Joshua to bring them into the land. And in that time frame, there's the priest and that God has chosen and authorized and instructed as to how to dress, how to groom, how to handle the offerings, the sacrifices, the feast days, all of those things, and to teach Israel what they should do and should not do. And Samuel was a very special person in many, many ways as a judge in Israel. And he spent his lifetime kind of as a traveling judge. He moved from place to place, and then where he went, apparently if there were people that had disputes among themselves or disagreements of one kind or another, he was a judge, and he's the one that pretty much helped them sort out the problems that you're always going to have when you're working with people. You need a judge of some kind, somebody hopefully that people respect, and hopefully that has character and has a commitment to the truth and has no bias or prejudice or ill feelings towards somebody that may have some kind of a dispute with somebody else, but it would be able to be objective and balanced and render a judgment in the situations. And Israel seemed to do pretty well with Samuel. However, as he got older, then he appointed his sons judges, and they didn't follow in his footsteps as far as being a man of character or men of character, and men who were unbiased and not selfish, and they sought the truth, and they were fair and even-handed in their dealings with the people. So then the people complained. But their complaint was not against the people who were not the judges that they would like to have, but their complaint was against the system. They wanted to change the system. And so they looked around them and they saw that all the nations in the land had kings. And somehow they thought that would be a wonderful thing, and they would like to have kings. And so that's what they said. They said, make us a king like the nations around us. And they figured he would go out in and out before them. He would lead them in battle. He would protect them, guide them, direct them. And we ended our time together Tuesday night in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And we looked at verses 11 through 22. And I pointed out that, and in that chapter, in that context, God is telling Samuel to warn the people, you want a king like the nations around you, this is what you're going to get. And this is what he's going to do. And he tells them of all of the things that they have that the king is going to appropriate for himself, and that the skill of some of the people that the king is going to have work for him, not for the people that he ruled over as a king. And I mentioned that in that passage, and it starts out, this will be the behavior of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons for his chariots. And he goes through a whole list of his chariots, for his horsemen, for and those that would run ahead of his chariots. He'll appoint captains of his thousands and captains of his 50s, and he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves, and he's going to take that. And it's interesting, and I don't want to spend a lot of time with it because I want to move on, but it's interesting that at least 13 times in this passage, we have the expression, he's going to take something of yours and it'll become his, or something of yours that will work for him. In other words, he's going to be taking from you, the people, your crops, your best young man, your best of everything that you have that he could use to further his best interest, his comfort, and his success in his eyes, he's going to take it from you. And the word his is in there 13 times, and I think I just counted another one, maybe 14. And yours that would become his, is the word yours is in there 15 times. And it's all negative, really, to the nation Israel if they were looking at it objectively. But they had a vision in their own mind. So we read, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. So his warnings they threw out, even though he'd been faithful and just and balanced and fair and judged them almost all of his life. He's an old man now. And yet they don't pay any attention to his advice to them at this point of the time. And so they said, they refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, we'll have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations. And they don't stop to realize that the nations are the nations that God is driving out of the land because of their wickedness and giving the land to the nation Israel. And they go on to say, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when you look at that and you say, okay, where's the king going to get all the manpower, all the wealth, all of the cost to do all of this for you? And they forget, like most everybody forgets, when most any government, whatever kind of government is, says, well, we will give this to you. We will do this for you. We will provide for this. You can trust us. Nobody stops to realize that government, or regardless of what the type of government is, they generally, excuse me, they generally, excuse me, they generally have to take it from their subjects in the form of tax or appropriation or something. But that's the way they were, and so they ignored all the 13, 14 times that you're going to provide for him and his needs, and it's going to come from you and your assets and things, and they ignored it completely. So the Lord said to Samuel, heed their voice, make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, every man go to his city. Now then as I said, I want to back up. I said the other day I wanted to back up and look at Samuel, because Samuel's a very special person, and Samuel was used of God and came to be a servant of God in a kind of unusual way, because Samuel was born to a father and a mother. The father's name was Elkanah, the mother's name was Hannah, and the father had two wives. One of them's name was Peninnah, and the other's name was Hannah, and I don't know which one he had first or whether he got them both at the same time, but he had two wives. One had children, one didn't. And of course, for a woman, particularly in those days and particularly in Israel, to not be able to bear children was considered a very negative thing. And then, and so she prayed to God, and I want to read some of what comes down, because to me it's really interesting. Here's a man with two wives, and one of them can bear children, one of them cannot bear children. The one of them that can bear children apparently rubs it in, or belittles or looks down on or makes negative comments about the wife that has no children, and she's sad and sorrowful, and her husband loves her and apparently is doing all that he can to be to her what he can be, and she finally prays to God, and God and she made a promise to God. She promises God that she's gonna, if he will give her a son, that she will dedicate him to the Lord for his lifetime. And God did. But I want to follow that general course for a little bit, particularly this morning. Probably won't get much more than that. But so if we start out with in 1 Samuel chapter 1, Elkanah is the father's name. He would soon be the father of Samuel. In verse 2, we're told that he had two wives. The one was Hannah, the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah, who would someday be Samuel's mother, Hannah had no children. And then in verse 3, there was a man who had sons. His name was Eli. He was the priest, the high priest at that time. And so Elkanah took Hannah and Peninnah, and every year went from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord in Shiloh. That's in verse 3 of chapter 1. And Eli, the high priest, had his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they were priests of the Lord, we read. But we will find out as we go on that those two men are wicked men. They really are wicked men. And as the story develops, we'll find that Eli, if he had been faithful to God and true to God in dealing with the sins of his own family, they would not have been alive, as I understand the Mosaic Law. Because the sins that they were committing were capital crimes at that time. And then in verse 4, we get some information about, again, Elkanah and Hannah and Peninnah as they go up to Shiloh to worship. And Elkanah gave his wives, we read, excuse me, a portion for dinner, and gave Hannah a double portion because he loved her, though she had no children. And then it says her rival, Peninnah, provoked her every year. And so every year they'd go up and they'd go through this same routine. They would go up to Shiloh. Apparently Elkanah would provide provision for the two wives. I don't know whether they had one grand dinner together, both wives, and if there was children from both mothers, both children, or whether Peninnah had a dinner for her and her children, and Hannah wound up having the dinner just her and Elkanah. I don't know how it worked. I don't know the mechanics of it. But I know that it wasn't a very good situation from the standpoint of Hannah. So Elkanah tries to make up for it in some way, but it doesn't solve the problem because, again, Peninnah apparently is a rival, and she provokes her every year. And so in 1 Samuel 1:8 we read that Elkanah, apparently, her husband, talked to Hannah, and he says, "Why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" Well, I think there's a couple lessons that we can learn there. There's sometimes that there are things that will trouble a wife, that will maybe a loss because of a death, or maybe something like this, that she doesn't seem to be able to bear children. And no matter how much her husband does, he can't make up for that loss, and he can't comfort that grief. And there's times and situations where we're either going to deal with our grief, our loss, our sorrow by casting it on the Lord, or nothing that anybody else can do can really change the situation. Because here's a woman that every year is going through this routine, and she's crying, she's not eating, her heart is grieved. Her husband recognizes it, and he says, "I try to be better." And apparently he does things that at least he considered should accomplish that. That he was tried to be kinder to her, more generous with her than 10 sons would have been. But it doesn't solve her own personal problems. She's got to deal with that her way and between her and the Lord. So in the 9th verse of the 1st chapter of 1 Samuel, Hannah rose after they finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. And then there's an observation. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle of the Lord. So what Hannah's going to do is she's going to go and make a petition to God at the tabernacle, and Eli the priest is watching, sitting by the gatepost of the tabernacle. And so Hannah goes in verse 11 of chapter 1 and made a vow and said, "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant." In other words, she looked at that, her inability to have a child, as an affliction. And I mean, I know people, I've talked to people, tried to encourage people that were women and were married and couldn't have children. And I know for many of them, it's very sad. Sad to say, really sad to say, is we live in a world where there's a high percentage of women that would be glad not to be able to have children. And they're not really interested in being mothers and being homemakers and focusing their skills, their abilities on bringing up children that would be the next generation of people for whatever society or population they live in. But she said, "If you indeed will look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life." So in other words, she's making a commitment. "Lord, if you give me a son, I'll give him to you, basically, and he'll serve you." And the understanding, as I understand it, is that it would be in the temple. It would be with Eli, with those that were involved in the tabernacle and the worship, the sacrifices, the offerings. There was a lot of work to be done in that environment, and whatever and then however Eli saw fit to use him, he would be there to serve the Lord in that environment. And she goes on to say, "And no razor shall come upon his head," and so he's going to be dedicated, she says, to serving the Lord. And Eli's sitting there watching her pray, and he sees her mouth working, but she's not praying out loud. She's just we would say mouthing. She's going through the movement of saying something, but she's not producing the noise. There's no sound coming out. And we read in verse 12 that it happened as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli watched her mouth. Well, for me personally, as I read about Eli, there's some things that I've already suggested that I think Eli had something missing in the way he came to conclusions and chose to do or not do certain things. And he's watching this, and he comes to a conclusion, which I don't quite know why. I would think that there would be a lot of people that would come to the tabernacle to come to pray and would be overcome, maybe weeping, maybe praying, but like Hannah is, but not letting the voice out, but her thoughts, her heart is praying, and her lips are moving consistent with if she was letting the voice out, I would think that he would understand what's going on. But in this case, I don't think he got it at all. Now Hannah spoke in her heart, we read, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli thought she was drunk. Well, again, to me, to come to that conclusion at that point in that setting doesn't seem reasonable. But anyway, he thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, how long will you be drunk? Again, I would have thought that if he thought maybe she was drunk, he might want to go up, maybe put his arm around her and say, is something troubling you? Have you had too much to drink or something? But he doesn't do it. Eli said to her, how long will you be drunk? He's already made a judgment that she's drunk. Put wine away from you. And Hannah answered and said, no, my Lord, I'm a woman of sorrowful spirit. Again, I would have thought Eli would have had a clue that that might be the case. But I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now. So Hannah makes an appeal really to Eli. I haven't drunk wine, I haven't drunk strong drink. I have a sorrowful heart. And out of the abundance of my complaint and grief, I'm speaking to God. And that's what she was doing. And Eli answered and said, go in peace. I don't know whether this is an apology or not, but I think when we look at Eli, all of us who are inclined to judge other people need to realize that when you're looking at what's going on from the outside, it may indicate that a person is this, or maybe that they're that. We may see somebody do something and say, oh, they're proud. They may be. They may not be. Maybe they're afraid. And it's producing the same thing. They're greedy. Well, maybe they're not greedy, but maybe they've gone through a time when there was a lot of famine and they were at the point of starvation, and now they've got enough, and they're very protective of it, and they're afraid to share it, and again they're operating from another motivation. In this case, well, people that are intoxicated may at times mutter to themselves, and you can't understand what they're saying, or they're not saying anything, they're just talking like that. Maybe so, but there could be another explanation. My point is, we need to be really careful before we make a conclusion or jump to a conclusion that we really understand what the motivation is. Now, that there may be some kind of conduct that it's got to stop. Doesn't make any difference what the motivation is, but it's got to stop. And in that case, something has to be done. But we need to be really careful when we assume that we know what the motivation is, when we never will be able to really know the heart of anybody to know for sure what their motivation is. Sometimes people do things that cause them to be seem as though they're very generous, and really they're not generous. They want people to think that they're generous. Sometimes people are talk a lot because they're really outgoing and they want to communicate with people, and other times maybe people do that because they want to impress people. We don't know. Just like Eli, and Eli should have by this time in his life, because he's an old man, had a lot of experience and realized, you know what, there's been a lot of things in my life as a priest, as in teaching the nation Israel, as correcting the nation Israel when they needed it, rebuking them at times, encouraging them at other times, that I didn't call it right. But he doesn't seem to have got that. But he does say, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you've asked of him. And she said, let your maidservant find favor in your sight. So apparently she took that as he was joining with her in her appeal to God to provide what she asked for, and she asked that she be viewed with favor in his sight. And she apparently believed that she was, because the next thought is, so the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. At that point, remember, she was weeping, she was not eating, and she was very sad. But she went away, her way, and ate, and her face was no longer sad. And then they arose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord and returned to the house of Ramah. And Elkanah knew his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Now then, Elkanah knowing his wife is one of those expressions the translators used, I think because they didn't want to say, well, the fact is that the two people came together, they had sexual love, intercourse, and that's what produces children if you're going to have children. Not that doesn't mean they hadn't before or anything else, but I'm just saying that's what it was. They get to know his wife means more than just that he knew her, of course, as far as this is Hannah, this is my wife. I'd like for you to meet her. But in this case, it's the relationship of husband and wife in a sexual relationship which produces children. He knew his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So it came to pass in the process of time that Hannah conceived and bore a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, because I've asked for him from the Lord. Now the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer the yearly sacrifice and his vow, but Hannah didn't go up. So after she's expecting the child, or maybe after the child is born, she doesn't go up because I would understand from what I understand from the rest of the story that she knew that at some point that when she went up there, she was going to take him up there and leave him there. And probably she was not in any big hurry to do that. And so what her request to Elkanah was, Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, not until the child is weaned, and then I will take him, that he may appear before the Lord and remain there forever. So she's going to keep him, she's going to nurse him, she's not going to go up and travel with the rest of the family, and her husband is for that, and tells her that, that's fine. Now Elkanah said to her, do what seems best to you, wait until you've weaned him, only let the Lord establish his word. So the woman stayed and nursed her son until she had weaned him. Now, and I don't know how old that was. It's obviously today even there is a wide disparity in the amount of time that mothers, some will spend weaning their children, some on maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe more. In other cases, maybe 6 months. Maybe at time cases they find they can't nurse their children at all. I don't know how old he was. I would like to know. But from what I get from it, he must have been old enough that he was able to take care of himself, get up, clothe himself, take care of his physical needs, eat, go to bed, sleep, get up, talk to, when he thought that Eli, the priest, had called him in the middle of the night, and it wasn't Eli, it was the Lord, but he didn't recognize the Lord's voice. He gets up and goes to where Eli is sleeping and talks to Eli, and then goes back to his own bed. So I don't know how old he was. If I was going to tell you what I feel like he was probably about 4 or 5 years old. But I don't know. But anyway, she did. In verse 24, we're told, when she had weaned him, she took him with her with 3 bowls, 1 ephah of flour, a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, and the child was young. So that's all we know about his age. He was young. Then they slaughtered a bull and brought the child to Eli, and she said, "Oh, my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I'm the woman who stood by you here praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition, which I ask of him. Therefore I also have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord." So they worshiped the Lord there. So Samuel is really a unique person from the very beginning. Ceci, I have no time. He's a unique person, and he from the beginning came to be in this life because of his mother's appeal to God for a son, and he was committed by his mother from the time he was born, or at least from the time he was weaned, for the rest of his life to serve the Lord, and he did. He did. And it's interesting that in the next chapter, chapter 2, Hannah prays again to God. And it's interesting to me because, and this is one of those prayers that I think I was talking about earlier, the first time we went over the subject, that we need to rightly divide. If you read this account and you believe that God's program for today is the same as God's program was with Israel at the time that Hannah prayed to God for a son, that she would commit him to the Lord for his lifetime if God enabled her, miraculously changed the natural course of events, and therefore everything that goes on, as this prayer will seem to indicate, and we'll read through it, but if you think that's what the way God's program is, or what God's program is today, it's not. And so if you think in your heart that you ever prayed for anything, and I know there are people within the sound of my voice that have prayed to God for things that their heart desired. They were not bad things. They were not things that would be wrong for them to have. But it doesn't happen. I know people that have prayed that a child would live, and it didn't live. I know people that have prayed for a husband, a spouse, or a wife, a husband or a wife, that they would live if it be the Lord's will. But it didn't happen. And the inclination is that somehow there's something wrong with me, and I think Satan wants us to say, "See, God didn't answer your prayer. What's wrong with woman? What's wrong with you?" And that's not the right question. The question is what happened with Hannah what I should expect would happen today if I were a young man, desired to serve the Lord, married a woman, and we didn't have any children, and she was terribly disturbed about it, and asked the Lord to enable her to bear a child. Should he do that? Is that something that he's doing today? Is that part of his program? Or is it more surely that he's promised that whatever it is that we face in the way of tests and trials today, he'll give us the strength to bear it. He will give us peace in the times of trouble that passes all understanding. But he hasn't promised, as he promised Israel, very pointed, very specific, "You obey me, I will curse you," and it's spelled out in great detail. You obey me, I think I said I'll curse you. If you obey me, I'll bless you. If you disobey me, I will curse you. And it's spelled out in very clear and very precise detail in all the areas. Their crops, their herds, their land, their children, their all down the line. He would change the natural course of events either for them or against them, depending on the life they lived. And so I believe we need, as we go into a prayer like this or a story like this that we've just read, and I'm not using story, it's not fiction, it's reality, an account of something that happened like this, that we're really careful to ask the four questions. Who's speaking? To whom is he speaking? On whose authority? And for what period of time? Because Hannah prayed and said, my heart rejoices in the Lord. My heart is exalted in the Lord. I shall smile at my enemies. And I assume that she's reflecting on whoever it was that was giving her a hard time because she had no children. I will smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. No one is holy like the Lord. That's true for all times. There's none beside you. That's true for all times. Nor is there a rock like our God. And that's true, except that for the church, we benefit in a spiritual sense more than in a physical sense with land and multiplied descendants and multiple crops and winning in battle and being the head and not the tail of the nations and possessing a significant piece of real estate. The church doesn't have any of that, but God is still the same God. And then she says, I assume speaking to those who had given her a hard time, talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty men are broken, and those who stumbled are girded with strength. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, and the hungry have ceased to hunger. Even the barren has borne 7, and she who has many children has become feeble. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and brings up. The Lord makes poor and he makes rich. He brings low and he lifts up. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the beggar from the ash heap to set them among princes and makes them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's. I can't read through that and say that applies to me physically, financially, health-wise, economically, for today. That's not God's promise to me for today. But that was his promise to Israel. No question about it. And she goes on, for the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he set the world upon them. He will guard the feet of his saints. But the wicked shall be silent in darkness. For by strength no man shall prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken in pieces. From heaven he will thunder against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. So this has to be understood in the light he's speaking to a woman of Israel, to the nation of Israel, at a time when God has promised them that if you serve me and obey me, I will bless you. If you disobey me, I will curse you. And people are not, just because they ignore the Lord and seem to be successful, in time he will bring them down. At times when they seem to be down and it looks like maybe they're not pleasing the Lord, he will bring them up. But that's what he promised to the nation Israel, and that's not his program for today. So then we move into chapter 2. Elkanah went to his house at Ramah, but the child ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. I don't know how the child felt. I would think that would be a little scary. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't really know. But I know that if I were Samuel's parents, I would have been really anxious if they knew what was going on in the temple, in the tabernacle, in the tabernacle. Because what Eli's sons were doing was gross immorality and a gross violation of the instruction from God as to how the priests were to receive the meat that was offered in sacrifices for their own consumption. They were supposed to take of that food and eat it. And I'll go ahead and we'll go on through the account, but what Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were doing was a terrible thing. And in the 12th verse, while the child, Samuel, ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest, in the last part of verse 11, the next thought in verse 12 is, the sons of Eli were corrupt. The sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. They were in the tabernacle. They were serving the people in the sacrifices. They were eating of the sacrifices, as was legitimate, but they didn't know the Lord. Just because you go to church doesn't make you a Christian, any more than because you drive your Chevrolet into the Ford garage will make it a Ford. There is something that will turn a lost, guilty sinner to a child of God, but it's accepting Jesus Christ as our personal Savior, crying out to God for forgiveness, and having a commitment of heart and mind to serve Him, and to read and study His Word so that we may know what that means to serve Him. The sons of Eli were corrupt, but Samuel, the child, ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. Verse 13 says, the priest's custom with the people was that when a man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged flesh hook in his hand, and while the meat was boiling, then he would thrust it into the pan or the kettle or the cauldron or the pot. I guess they were different vessels or enough words to describe them so that we know what they were doing for sure. And the priest would take for himself what the flesh hook brought up. So the meat was cut up, tossed into a pot. It was boiling in water, and the priest would stick in this flesh hook. And I picture something with 3 prongs on it. I'm not sure what it had, and bring it up, and then whatever was on it, he'd take it home, give it to his wife, I assume, and she'd fix it for them, and they'd eat it. But Eli's sons, they didn't like boiled meat, and so they did that sometimes, but they didn't do that, or some maybe that worked in the tabernacle did it, but we read they did it in Shiloh to all the Israelites that came there. Also, but in addition, they burned the fat. The priest servants would come and say to the man who sacrificed, "Give me for roasting to the priest, for he will not take broiled meat from you." So the guy comes to the people that are offering the sacrifice, and it's being boiled, and he'll say, "No, we want it before." He doesn't want boiled meat. He wants raw meat. "Give meat for roasting to the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw." And if the man said they should really burn the fat first, then I understand from the way this is being said that if they took the meat before they threw it in the pot and cut the fat off of it and burned it, that would be acceptable. He says they should really burn the fat first, and then you may take as much as your heart desires. And he would then answer him, no, you must give it now. And if not, I will take it by force. That's the kind of environment Samuel's being raised in. That's the kind of people Eli's sons were. That's why they're referred to partly as being corrupt and not knowing God. And we read in verse 17, therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. Also, it'll come out in just a few minutes that they were committing fornication with the women that came to the tabernacle. So it was morally a deteriorated and a corrupt situation that Samuel was being raised in. And the parallel I like to make with that is that I believe we live, and those of us who are raising children, and if you're a child, a young person that you're being raised today, you're being raised in a very corrupt environment. Not any worse probably than Samuel was being raised in, but it's a pretty corrupt environment. And we read about Samuel in verse 18, but Samuel ministered before the Lord, even as a child, wearing a linen ephod. So Samuel worked in that environment before the Lord, even in that environment. And it goes on in chapter 2 and verse 19 that his mother would bring him a little robe year by year when she came with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah, his wife, and say, the Lord give you descendants from this woman for the loan that was given to the Lord. And then they would go to their own home. So every year they went, and every year she brought a different robe, and I don't know what she did when he got to be a man. It would start maybe as a pretty small robe when he's a child, but I don't know how big a man he was, but let's say he was 6 feet tall. It'd be a good sized robe. But she was still his mother, and that was, from all we have from the account, about the extent of their interaction. I'm sure they visited and they talked and some, but she would bring him a robe every year. Now, how long she did that, I don't know. And he goes on to say in verse 21 that the Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived both 3 sons and 2 daughters. So she had 6 children altogether. And then there's another expression. Meanwhile, the child Samuel grew before the Lord. So in this environment, Samuel is growing all of the time. He knows more about the scriptures. He knows more about the Mosaic law. He sees what's being done. He knows what the scriptures say should be done. And he gets some insight from God that he has to reveal to Eli that is very scary for a young person to do. But in verse 22, then we pick up Eli and his situation. Eli was very old. I don't know how old that is. Maybe he was my age, 82. Maybe he was older. I don't know. But he was very old. And he had heard everything his sons did to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So he knew that they were immoral with the women that came to the tabernacle. He knew that they were desecrating the offerings, that portion of which they were to take for their food, but only after burning the fat or taking it from a boiling pot. He knew that. And he knew that the people were abhorring the sacrifice because of the conduct of his sons. And so then the question is, what should he do? What should he do? Well, what he does is, as far as I'm concerned, very anemic. And I don't think that's just my opinion. I think that's borne out by the consequences of what he does, or more important, what he did not do in the situation involving his sons. But what he did do, as stated in the text, is verse 23, why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings, from all the people. Why do you do such things? I hear of your evil dealings with all the people. No, my sons, for it is not a good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people transgress. Now, I don't know what was going on. I don't know whether they were forcing the women that came, whether they were raping them. I don't know whether they were enticing them. I don't know whether the women were afraid of them because they had authority on their side. I don't know anything about those details. But I do know that Eli knew enough to know that they were making the Lord's people transgress. And he poses the question, if one man sins against another, God will judge him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? In other words, when you get to the level that you're disobeying God, you're violating God's law, then there's going to be consequences. But in my notes I put here, this is a very anemic response for what really was a capital crime under the Mosaic law. But the text says, nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of their father because the Lord desired to kill them, not him. I want to stop and think about Samuel again just a minute, and then I'm going to close, because there's a verse in chapter 3, we haven't got to it, but it says, Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. That's a pretty amazing statement, because he goes into this wicked environment as a very young boy. And he basically is raised in this environment to a young man. And then an old man as he serves the nation Israel throughout his lifetime as a judge. But when we think about Samuel, there's about 4 passages of scripture that mention him, and they all mention him in a positive light. In 1 Samuel 2:21, we read, the Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the child Samuel grew before the Lord. Now, that you could say, well, that was just in front of the Lord. You don't know whether it was positive or negative, but in light of the fact that there isn't any negative, I'm going to take it that it's positive, because there is some positive. And then in chapter 2, moving down in verse 26, the child Samuel grew in stature and in favor, both with the Lord and men. So he's a lily, you might say, growing out of the mud, because morally he's in a pretty muddy, mucky environment. And the example certainly being set by Eli's sons, and the lack of Eli dealing effectively with the sin of his sons, if it's going to do anything, it's going to tend to make him feel bitter, or that there's no real value in serving the Lord, or doesn't make too much difference whether you do or whether you don't. But Samuel's able to keep his orientation between him and God. And so he grew in stature and in favor, both with the Lord and men. And my point in emphasizing these passages is, I know young people that are being raised today in a pretty corrupt, confused, frustrated world in which we live. And I know parents that are trying to point their children and trying to set an example before their children. I know parents that aren't setting a very good example. So even children raised in an environment where the example may be terrible, they still can grow up and mature and have a commitment between themselves and the Lord, and it be said of them, the child grew in stature and favor both with the Lord and with men. And I know some children that have done that. I know some. I know some children that haven't too. So again, it comes back to the commitment that each of us have in our own personal heart between us and the Lord. And while we look at the world around us, and I see it going down as far as the country and the strength and the might and the integrity of the country, I see it going downhill. Yet, the fact is that I do know children are being raised, have been raised in a deteriorating environment, and they do find favor both with the Lord and with men. And then 1 Samuel 3:19 to me is a passage that when I first, I don't know, years and years, when I was young, before I was married even, but that passage, Samuel grew, I think probably my mother taught it to me, that's why I know it. Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. Children, normally speaking, tend to be not too careful about what they say, not too accurate sometimes about what they conclude. They seem to everything in blacks and whites. But children can learn to be respectful, to be polite, to be courteous, to be honest, to be moral. They can have a commitment of heart and mind to be that way because of their love for God and His provisions for them, regardless of the world they live in, the environment, the home they came out of. We can all go back and live in such a way as to be right before God. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 9, there's a passage of scripture when Samuel's old, and actually it's a son of Saul, the man that would become the first king of Israel, that's looking for his father's his father's donkeys, and he can't find them. And he says to the person going next to him, or the traveling with him, look, there is in this city a man of God, and he is an honorable man. All that he says surely comes to pass. Let us go there. Perhaps he can show us the way that we should go. And he actually, it was Saul talking. He was not Saul talking. It was Saul's son talking, and he was looking for Saul's donkeys. And his servants make the suggestion that let's go see Samuel. And he describes him as a man, and in this case, he's getting to be a pretty old man. And he says, in this city, he's a man of God. He's an honorable man. All that he says surely comes to pass. Let's go there. And he wants to go see Samuel. So Samuel, who grew and the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground, is now an old man. But that's his reputation. He's an honorable man, and what he says, it comes to pass. Let's go talk to him. Maybe he can point us in the direction of our animals. So I want to leave that both. 1 Samuel 3:19 is a passage that every young person, I believe, should commit to memory, and then should be a beacon, you might say, in their eyes as they go through life and decide, this I'm going to do, this I'm not going to do, these kind of things I'm going to say, these kind of things I'm not going to say, this is what I'm going to read, this is what I'm going to find entertainment from, I'm not going to go there for entertainment. These are the values from the Bible that I want to follow. These values from the world, I don't care about. And it's interesting that while the expression in 1 Samuel 3:19 is said when Samuel's pretty young, the fact is that Solomon said in Proverbs 20 verse 11, even a child is known by his deeds, whether what he does is pure and right. Even a child. Very young at age, you can have a commitment to serve the Lord, so help me God, and he will help you. And yet in Israel, whose parents were supposed to bring up their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, we read that what happened with Eli and his sons was not that unusual, because in Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 12, Isaiah the prophet charges Israel that is by that time deteriorating and being scattered among the nations. As for my people, Israel, children are their oppressors. Well, that wouldn't be a child that the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. Children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, those who lead you cause you to err and destroy the way of your paths. And if you go back and look at some of the conduct of many of the kings, it wasn't very good. But whether you're being raised in the United States or some other part of the world today, or we're back in the time of Samuel, you can grow, and the Lord will be with you if you commit your heart to him and accept him as your Savior, and he will enable you to not have your words fall to the ground. And parents, don't give up. Keep on trying to, but the most important thing is the example that you set and have set in the eyes and minds of your children. I'll stop there. Lord willing, we'll pick it up here Tuesday night.